Good evening. I am going to do my critical analysis of systemic racism in education and school counseling on this occurrence called new racism or neoliberal and deficit discourses that are really prevalent in K through 12 schools. So the first aspect of new racism I wanted to address is called evaded racism. And this is from one of the articles that I found that outlined three types. So evaded racism, anti-racism, and everyday racism. And it's characterized as being subtle and covert. And another article referred to this kind of occurrence as discursive strategy. And the reason why this is so prevalent is because it's challenging to identify. It's very highly normalized in schools, and it's hidden under the guise of multiculturalism, colorblindness, diversity, and serves to benefit the students of color and has good intentions, supposedly. However, the research from this article shows that with evaded racism, the blame is usually placed on students of color and families for academic struggles because of their cultural practices or lifestyle or socioeconomic status, instead of looking at shifts in the oppressive or racist policies or structures. They address these challenges, encouraging students to change their behavior or families to do more things that more like white families do, like reading to their children or adopting like a growth mindset, and kind of like changing their own mindset to fit the school culture mindset. There's emphasis on the achievement gap and short-term solutions to kind of to say this achievement gap is the focus and not the structures that cause the achievement gap in the first place. And they also promote something called the culturally responsive pedagogy. But if this is done without addressing how racism plays into pedagogy, then it just perpetuates the current system of whiteness. Another article that I tried to connect this concept to I found that had some overlap with this idea is called deficit discourse, which is a discursive strategy for policymaking by avoiding the topic of racism. For example, labeling students at risk. So using certain language to frame a policy or some kind of intervention that a school will use to help students of color. And I wanted to include this quote: overall, when policy insiders use strategies associated with deficit discourse, asserting that those most negatively impacted by inequality cause inequality. So those who are most impacted by racial inequality they're the ones that are causing it. The next factor I wanted to discuss is anti-racist racism at school. So this is when you use the framework of equity, justice, and anti-racist rhetoric. This includes this kind of practice of neoliberal racism where the policies of a district or state will prioritize school choice over the funding public schools. And this can lead to replacing Black teachers and Black admin with white employees. And sometimes a lot of this is also replacing, a certain school culture that's white-centered. And it also implements profit-driven standardized testing, which is usually masked as like, oh, we're doing accountability and this is so that we can increase equality. School choice policies, research has shown to, mostly affirm white racial hierarchy, and they usually benefit affluent and white students. The same for charter schools. Charter schools have been shown to actually increase segregation. So the next aspect of anti-racist racism is colorblindness. When instead of attributing racism to a whole system or culture, it's blamed on just one individual, usually the bad apple of the group, instead of addressing the issue as like a whole community. It's just like, oh, just one person who displayed violence. So there's no accountability for anybody else except for that one person. And it's also encourages tracking students without considering inequality that exists in the system. So example is usually students who are tracked are students of color who have behavior issues or academic issues, are usually described as lazy or have unstable families. Or maybe lazy is not the best word, unmotivated, which is a euphemism for lazy. Also, white teachers who aren't racially literate and they just avoid the entire topic of racism, designating ELL students, and enforcing an English speaking policy at school is racializing and undermining students' ability to fulfill their academic potential in their own native language. There's also an overrepresentation of Black and Latinx students designated as special ed due to cultural deficits and pseudoscientific placement. And this quote, without addressing racism, the need to pacify, control, and exclude Black and brown bodies alongside ableism, students of color continue to be prevented from reaching their academic potential. Okay, so the third part of new racism is everyday racism, which includes racial microaggressions against students of color. And this includes school policies and practices, such as teachers being colorblind, mispronouncing student names, giving them harsher disciplinary consequences than their white counterparts. And this is known to cause lasting and damaging psychological impact on students and their own self-perceptions. For example, 1/3 of African-American students in suburban schools, no matter how much no matter how many resources they have and support from their families, it's shown that it's not enough to protect them from the othering experience they have in these schools. One study showed that in one state that they conducted their qualitative study, not qualitative, it was quantitative, that Black girls are disproportionately punished due to their perceived bad attitudes and their criminalization of appearance. Also, implicit bias, historical and contemporary racism in school, it affects the curriculum, the resource disparities, and teacher competencies, has a lot of deep psychological impact on students of color. So this idea of racial neoliberalism, I explored in one of the articles that did a study in a school that was implementing SROs, which are school resource officers. And they showed how using signals or language that signaled racial equity or anti-racism to kind of cover up racist policies or ideologies, or even just to avoid these ideologies or structures. And um, instead of using funds or money towards initiatives that research shows help students of color, this school decided to take this on as like a racial project and have these SROs or school resource officers who are usually Black men and kind of turn them into these mentor figures or counselors to troubled students, and kind of equip them in being trauma informed, um, doing restorative practices and acting as counselors, as like people who can relate, students can relate to them. However, so on the surface, this looks like a very like, oh, we're being anti-racist because we're trying to build connections and do restorative practices. However, these officers have the power of, they're basically like police officers. And so they could easily enforce the rules. They can easily use um, physical means to control students. And it just goes to show how this neoliberalism, using this kind of discourse, can really mask some, just this underlying tradition of the school to prison nexus. And that's what this article was exploring. So some ways to confront the systems that I just discussed is increasing racial literacy and critical pedagogy in the schools, which includes professional development for teachers, counselors, and admin, implementing a curriculum based on race and racism, such as having an ethnic studies requirement, promoting positive racial identity and resilience, using a lot of storytelling, theater, and art in learning and teaching students, including student and community-based activism and service. And also, my apologies, if you are a teacher or a school counselor running for political offices at the local level, can be very, can really affect the community in powerful ways. For example, you can initiate a referendum on having SROs. And in this one study, that's what happened when certain community members who were against having SROs were elected into the school board and were able to really make some changes in their school system. And here are my references. Thank you very much for listening.